Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. On Monday, President Trump signed an executive order saying that to burn an American flag is an act that could be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. This is drawing lots of questions from First Amendment advocates, and joining us now to break down what it all means is Brian Hauss. He is a senior staff attorney with the ACLU's Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project. Brian, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to read you part of this executive order. This, I will emphasize, is just a portion and not the entire thing. But the executive order that Trump signed reads in part, "My administration will act to restore the respect and sanctity of the American flag and prosecute those who incite violence or otherwise violate laws while desecrating the symbol of our country to the fullest extent permissible under any available authority." There's a lot to unpack here, but broadly, can you break down what this executive order means?
Essentially, what the executive order does is instruct federal prosecutors to abuse their discretion and look for excuses to charge people who are engaged in acts of flag burning. Now, it's important to clarify here that the executive order does not and cannot create a new federal crime. Congress writes the criminal statutes, not the president. And so, and the Supreme Court held about 30 years ago that the First Amendment prohibits the government from criminally punishing burning of the flag or desecrating the flag because of the message that it sends. So that's not what President Trump is doing here. Instead, what he's doing is he's instructing federal prosecutors to look for excuses to charge people who are engaged in flag burning when the real motivation behind it, as the executive order makes clear, is the message that they're sending.
I have a lot of follow-up questions to what you just said, but just to be very clear and perhaps a little pedantic here, is what this executive order is saying, is that a violation of the First Amendment?
What the executive order is doing does violate the First Amendment because it's instructing federal prosecutors to target people on the basis of their protected expression. This is what's known as selective prosecution, right? So if a federal prosecutor is charging someone with a crime, even if they violated a statute, if the motivation behind the charging decision is impermissible, for example, because they're a Democrat or because of their protected expression, they can raise what's known as a selective prosecution defense, essentially saying that the real motivation for their prosecution is their speech and not any unlawful conduct that they might be engaged in. That's exactly what this executive order is instructing prosecutors to do.
The other piece of language that was interesting to me in the executive order is that under any available authority. That feels very specific to me, but I am not a lawyer. Did that stand out to you? And does that mean that federal agents could go after someone in a way that state agents would not? Is there a difference there?
So federal agents and state law enforcement officers do enforce different authorities. Federal law enforcement officers enforce federal statutes. State law enforcement officers enforce state criminal laws. In this case, what the executive order is telling federal prosecutors to do is look for any excuse. Let's say there's a federal ordinance that bans burning anything outdoors in a public park, right? And it's saying you can apply that ordinance. Maybe you wouldn't apply it in certain circumstances. Maybe you would enforce it in others. What I really want you to do is kick anybody who's burning an American flag in a public park up to the front of the line. And so while the government can neutrally enforce those statutes, right? It can make it a crime to burn things in certain public places. What it can't do is target someone for burning something because of the message that it sends. And that's what the executive order is telling prosecutors to do. It's saying, apply these statutes unequally to people on the basis of the message that they're trying to send.
And supporting what you just said, when he signed the executive order, Trump did say, quote, "When you burn the flag, it incites riots at levels we've never seen before." So in the president's view, is he trying to tamp down protests?
I mean, that's just pure rhetoric on the president's part. I think what he's referring to there is what's known as the incitement standard, right? There are certain circumstances speech is not protected when it incites unlawful violence. But the Supreme Court has applied a very, very robust First Amendment test to determine when something meets the definition of incitement, precisely because laws that enable the government to prosecute incitement have a very strong danger of being used to silence political protest. And so the Supreme Court has said that incitement can only be prosecuted when it's intended to incite unlawful violence and when there's an objective likelihood that it will incite imminent unlawful violence. And the fact of the matter is, the vast majority of circumstances where someone's burning a flag, even the American flag, it's not likely to incite imminent unlawful violence, and it's not intended to do so. And so the incitement statutes really have no application there. But even in those circumstances where the speech is unprotected, if the government is targeting that speech specifically because of the message it's sending, unrelated to whether it's incitement or whether it's a threat or something like that, but just because the government doesn't like the viewpoint of the person saying it, that still violates the First Amendment. Even with regards to unprotected speech, the government can't single out specific viewpoints for special punishments. And again, that's exactly what this executive order does.
Now, you mentioned a Supreme Court case. Is that the Texas v. Johnson case from 30 years ago? And if so, can you talk about what that case, the precedent that established, and what this executive order means for that precedent?
Sure thing. So Texas versus Johnson concerned a challenge to Texas's flag desecration statute. Texas, like almost every other state in the country at that time, had laws that prohibited desecrating the American flag. And somebody who burned the American flag in protest was prosecuted under that statute, and he appealed his conviction all the way up to the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court held in an opinion famously joined by Justice Scalia is that when the government is prosecuting flag desecration because of the message that it sends, because it's disrespecting the flag, which is exactly what President Trump is talking about here, that is viewpoint discrimination. And that goes to the heart of what the First Amendment is all about, which is it's a restriction on the government's ability to punish people for expressing disfavored views. As the Supreme Court once said, if there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it's that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in matters of politics. So applying that principle to the context of flag burning, the court held that the government can't punish people when they disrespect the flag. Now, that government can still punish people when they burn things in public, as I mentioned earlier, right? So if there's a neutral law that says you can't burn things in a public place, the government can still prosecute that even when the thing being burned is a flag. But the government can't target flag burning because of the message that it sends. That's what the Supreme Court held in Johnson.
So does it stand to reason then that this executive order could be considered by the Supreme Court because it appears to be challenging that Supreme Court ruling?
I think the most likely scenario here is that the government is going to start bringing prosecutions against people who are engaged in flag burning, and they're going to raise these selective prosecution defenses. They're going to say, I was targeted not because I violated this ordinance, but because of the message that my activity sent. And the government can't target me, regardless of whether they violated the statute. The government can't target them for their speech. I don't even know it'll get to the Supreme Court because, frankly, the law in this is so well established that I think that the lower courts will pretty robustly hold that the government can't do what President Trump is instructing federal prosecutors to do here.
Now, already within 24 hours of this executive order being signed, we have seen a flag burning incident. NBC News reported that a man was arrested and identified himself as a combat veteran and said he was burning the American flag in protest of the executive order that Trump signed. What do you make of this arrest, and could this executive order spark even more instances of flag burning?
So I can't opine on the specifics of this individual arrest. What I can say is that I think this executive order is going to have its intended effect, which is it's going to inspire a lot of people to engage in flag burning, to protest the executive order, which is probably in some level what President Trump wants, right? He wants to create a distraction. He wants to create political battles that distract public attention away from the numerous scandals plaguing his administration. That's what this executive order is designed to do.
What is the ACLU's response to this executive order? And also, what is the response you've seen from your colleagues, from people in public in the last 24 hours? Are people broadly pro, broadly con? Is there a public opinion that's beginning to coalesce?
I think that civil libertarians and people in the First Amendment community across the political spectrum are all incredibly dismissive of this executive order. They understand that it flies in the face of 30 years of bedrock First Amendment law. They understand that it's a political stunt by the Trump administration. And like so many political stunts of this administration, I expect it will soon be forgotten. by the public and by federal prosecutors, and it will be swept away as we move on to the next outrageous thing President Trump does.
So in the context of America 2025, where does this executive order land in terms of importance? Because we've seen some other actions from the federal government that would appear to seek to limit freedom of the press, free expression. Is this part of that, or is it, as you say, a political stunt?
I think this is part of a broader campaign by the Trump administration to undermine the robust free expression principles that have been built up by both sides of the political aisle, frankly, over the past 50 years. And this is an attempt to turn this into some sort of partisan fight. Unlike some of the other campaigns that the Trump administration is waging, for example, its attempt to deport students and scholars on the basis of their protected speech, I think that this one is really a political stunt by the administration that does not have a lot of gas in it. I don't think that it's going to be robustly enforced at all. I think federal prosecutors understand that targeting people on the basis of their protected speech for federal prosecution is a flagrant First Amendment violation. And I don't suspect that they are going to robustly enforce this executive order.
So if the reaction to this executive order is broadly dismissive, Brian, what are you spending most of your time at the ACLU focusing on, and what should the Forbes audience spend their time paying attention to when it comes to the issue of First Amendment rights and free speech?
I think there are numerous areas where the Trump administration is attacking First Amendment rights. Some of the most obvious ones are its attempt to impose sanctions on law firms that represent clients or causes that are disfavored by the administration. Those attempts are also blatantly unconstitutional. They were roundly rejected by every single federal court that's considered a case challenging those executive orders. But the chilling effect that those executive orders have had on the legal profession has been profound. And the danger that that poses to an independent bar and an independent judiciary and the functioning of America's legal system is very grave indeed. Similarly, I think President Trump's attacks on universities, denying hundreds of millions of dollars in funds unless universities toe the administration's preferred ideological line, represents a profound threat to principles of academic freedom that have made America's universities the envy of the world. And finally, I think the very pervasive way that the administration has been targeting non-citizens on the basis of their protected expression for deportation and for detention, throwing people like Mahmoud Khalil, Ramesa Ozturk, these students at America's universities in detention facilities thousands of miles away from their home, simply because they're engaging in protected protest. I think that represents a profound threat to basic civil discourse in this country. And I should say, in the interest of full disclosure, that the ACLU represents Mr. Khalil and Ms. Ozturk and several other of the students who are being targeted by the administration on these grounds. But those are campaigns where I think the administration has committed to trying to roll back fundamental First Amendment freedoms. As in this case, I think there's no chance the administration is going to commit to this phony war.
No chance the administration commits to this phony war. So if you're reading the tea leaves, what happens next when it comes to this executive order around flag burning? Does it just go away, get ignored, enforced a little bit, but other executive orders and administration action gets the attention? What's your prediction here?
There may be some federal prosecutors who attempt to curry favor with the Trump administration by making prosecutions in line with this executive order. But functionally, what this executive order has done has made it harder for any federal prosecutor to bring a prosecution on the basis that someone has burned an American flag. Because now any defendant who faces one of these prosecutions is going to have a very robust defense to come into court and say that they're being selectively prosecuted for their protected expression pursuant to this unconstitutional executive order. And so that's just actually going to make flag burning prosecutions of any type much, much more difficult for federal prosecutors in the medium term.
We've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything else, Brian, that you wish for the Forbes audience to know or understand about this executive order or the Trump administration's position when it comes to the First Amendment in 2025?
I think the most important thing for the Forbes audience to understand is that the First Amendment will continue to apply regardless of what the Trump administration says. President Trump is not the last word on our constitutional rights. We, as a country, get to decide what the Constitution means, and we do that by exercising our rights every day, and it's important not to be chilled by the president's stunts.
Brian Hauss, Senior Staff Attorney for ACLU's Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project. Thank you so much for joining us and providing us with your insight. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.